For anyone who was unable to be with us, we will have it on our YouTube and on our socials. So just want to let you know that it is being recorded. If you have questions throughout the conversation, feel free to put it in the question and answer box. Nikki, hi, from Healthy Schools Now is with us. Good evening, Greg Stankwitz. Good to have you with us. Good evening. So yeah, continue to let us know that you are here. We are excited to have with us two amazing education advocates who are also perfect because this is Teacher Appreciation Week and their roots are in education, being dynamic teachers within our school systems in New Jersey and New York, Dr. Leah Owens and Mr. Stan Karp. And we are here exploring issues of equity before the State Board of Education. And so before we get into the topic of today, I first want to welcome you on behalf of Our Children, Our Schools. Special thank you to Nicole Chulo, Yolanda Green, Sharon Kringle, who are with us in the background, who helped to convene Our Children, Our Schools. Our Children, Our Schools is a coalition of statewide education advocates organizations who spend their time championing for children in New Jersey. Our core tenets are full and fair funding, partnerships that support families and improve communities, reforms that enable schools and educators to do their jobs well, and increased accountability and transparency in education, policymaking and program. Hello, Mr. Martin. Darren Martin is with us. So good to have you. Our Children, Our Schools members are a mighty group, and we hope that if you're not a part of Our Children, Our Schools, that you consider joining us. My name is Kaleena Berryman. I am the proud co-convener with Yolanda Green of Our Children, Our Schools. And we also want to say hello to Yannick Taylor, who helps us as well to keep us moving forward. One of the focuses of 2023, which began in 2022 for Our Children, Our Schools, is on the New Jersey State Board of Education. As a community advocate in Newark fighting for justice for young people, for children, for families, I always paid attention to the local school board. But the State Board of Education is really the center of policymaking for New Jersey. Specifically, the State Board of Education adopts the administrative code, which sets the rules needed to implement state education law. Such rules cover the supervision and governance of the state's 2,500 public schools, which serve 1.38 million students. In addition, the State Board advises on educational policies proposed by the commissioner and confirms Department of Education staff appointments made by the commissioner. The State Board of Education is probably the most important entity. And yet, in June of this year, all 13 seats on the State Board of Education will be expired, meaning that all of the members currently sitting in the seats by June, all 13 will no longer be valid. They will all be expired. Governor Murphy last year began to make a stand to right this, and he nominated 3 dynamic educational professionals and advocates to the State Board of Education, without a shadow of a doubt, celebrated leaders who are specialists in various different areas, who have a history of working on behalf of young people, champions for public education, and they have not yet been confirmed. We have written letters, we have made phone calls, we have sent emails, and we just don't understand what is the holdup. There's something called senatorial courtesy, which I've learned about in this process, that gets in the way of making good decisions and moving things forward. And so the purpose of our forum is, 1, to educate the public in the importance of the State Board of Education and to make sure that we know the things that are relevant right now before them, but 2, to get more people saying, Governor Murphy, Senate Judiciary Committee, it is time to make sure that our State Board of Education has leaders in those seats who are not expired and who are working on behalf of our public schools, all right? So you're all caught up. We invite you to sign that petition. The petition is in the chat. Today's forum is about issues of equity. And we're going to talk about 2 things. It's really timely because last week's State Board of Education meeting saw 2 very important things. 1 was a conversation around the cut score for testing, and Stan Karp is going to tell us more about that. And then also there was a hearing on the Equity Code, the Managing Equity Code, and Dr. Owens is going to tell us about that. So I'm going to introduce them. And again, we welcome your questions in the chat, all right? Dr. Owens, Stan, how you feeling this evening?
Good, happy to be here.
Good, thank you. We are excited to have you both. So to formally introduce, Dr. Leah Owens is an educator, researcher, and founder of Just Writing LLC, former Newark Board of Education member, a graduate of Duke University in Rutgers, Newark, and a college professor in the field of education. Welcome, Dr. Owens, to our virtual forum. And then Stan Karp, also a former educator, is the director of the Secondary Reform Project for New Jersey's Education Law Center, which just celebrated its 50th anniversary. We had a beautiful celebration last week, so honored to be in attendance. Stan taught English and journalism in Patterson for over 30 years and is an editor of Rethinking Schools. Welcome, Stan, to our forum. You are no stranger to all things Our Children, Our Schools, so thank you. All right, so first we're going to turn it over to Stan. What is going on, Stan, in the State Board of Education around testing, cut scores, graduation requirements, all of those things?
Thank you, Kaleena. I'll do my best to answer. I'll try to see if I can share my screen here. Let's see. Can you see these slides yet?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, good. So I'm going to use these slides partially to organize the information, and I will make the slides available to Kaleena so that anyone who's interested in the information can either follow up with me or can not worry about taking notes while I'm running through them quickly, so not to take too much time. Today I'm going to try to answer 3 questions. What are the latest graduation rules? What do they mean for students, schools, and New Jersey's graduation rate? And what is the state board's role? Because I know the larger issue today is what is the role of state boards in setting such, policies around such a central equity issue as who gets to graduate from high school. And one of the central issues in New Jersey for some time has been the use of tests, the use of exit testing or graduation testing to determine who gets a diploma. Graduation testing in New Jersey originates from a state law that was passed over 40 years ago, a state law that is long due for review and reform. And that state law required the Commissioner of Education to develop a test to measure those basic skills that all students must possess to function politically, economically, and socially in a democratic society. And the language of the statute is basic skills. And that's one of the things that has been at the center of the debate at the state board for many years. How do you define those basic skills? What are the basic skills that you need, and can a standardized test actually evaluate them? And also, what's the difference between basic skills and college and career readiness and various ways in which these terms have been defined? And what does that have to do with a test that's given to students late in their high school career? The statute also requires an alternative assessment for students who do not pass the actual state exit test. And in 1988, about 10 years after the law was first passed, it was amended to move the graduation test from the 11th grade to the 9th grade. When it was first started in the 9th grade, it was supposed to be a diagnostic test to find out for students and young people coming into high school whether they had the skills they needed to succeed. And it made a certain amount of sense to do an evaluation of students in the 9th grade and then try to give them some support if it showed that they needed it. When the test was moved to 11th grade, it became less about supporting students and more as a kind of, a form of supposed accountability, where you were going to evaluate a student late in their high school career in a test that wasn't going to have any role in changing their education program or providing them services. It was simply going to be a barrier that they had to pass in order to get a high school diploma. It's also important to remember that this kind of graduation testing is a state requirement. It's not a federal requirement. Only about 7 or 8 states this year are still using exit testing. Most states have abandoned it because it hasn't proved a useful tool in improving services or improving schools. Over the last 40 to 45 years, New Jersey and the State Board of Education have used multiple tests to meet this requirement. I'd like to, to chant the list of tests that began with the MBS, go to HSPT 9, HSPT 11, HSPA, the High School Proficiency Assessment. It's sort of a secret handshake. If you meet anybody who's graduated from high school in New Jersey, you can ask them what test they had to pass, and it'll tell you when they graduated. But the other lesson that people did not really learn is as you kept changing the tests, maybe the tests weren't doing the job you thought they were doing. Maybe they weren't evaluating what we needed to find out. And instead, maybe we were just giving a lot of money to testing companies and changing the test from one set of initials to another. But one thing that stayed the same throughout all this is it was the state board that set the passing score for these tests based on voting on a resolution. And some of the discussions around these resolutions have been really instructive about what the state board is paying attention to and what the members of the state board are prepared to do or not. One of the problems is that the graduation rules in New Jersey have changed almost every year for the past decade. Even though the regulations say that when you enter high school, the districts are supposed to give students and families a reliable copy of what they have to do to get a state endorsed diploma. And districts haven't really been able to do that because the state and the state board have kept changing the rules. These debates got even more heated around 2012. And that's when the last of the state-made tests, the High School Proficiency Assessment, the HSPA, was probably the last test that was genuinely made by New Jersey teachers. And that was used as the graduation test. And it had passing rates of about 80 to 90% on the ELA section, 70 to 80% on the math. It was a little bit more than a basic skills test, but it was not a test that the majority of students couldn't do well on. And that was replaced during the period when Common Core and PARCC took over the education world. And PARCC had passing rates of approximately 60% on ELA, 50 to 60%, 40 to 50% on math. And that meant for a lot of students, this test was going to become a focus, an obstacle, and an obsession for schools. How are we going to get kids past this test? And this was the era when tens of thousands of parents and students in New Jersey started to opt out from state tests because they thought they were having a negative effect both on students and schools. It's during this period that the Education Law Center sued the state for trying to make PARCC the graduation test. And on behalf of the Latino Alliance and the NAACP and the Patterson Education Fund and other advocates, ELC challenged the state rules, which didn't conform to what the law had said. And it was also when Phil Murphy decided to run for governor, and when this issue was so prominent that during his campaign for his first election, he made a pledge to eliminate the high school exit test and to reduce the amount of high-stakes standardized testing we had in New Jersey, a pledge that so far has not been kept. Things got even more confusing during the pandemic because the testing requirement was suspended for the classes of 20 and 21 and reinstated for the class of 22 and then suspended again for the class of 23. So it became very confusing to track that. It was absolutely appropriate to suspend this requirement, which was, impossible for schools to really implement, and also a distraction from the more pressing, needs and demands that students had during this period. But the exit test requirement is again in place for the classes of 2024 and 2025. Those would be currently the juniors and the sophomores. To graduate, those students are going to have to take the NJGPA, and they're going to have to score at least 725 on both parts. And we'll talk a little bit more about that 725 in a minute. Those students who don't pass must pass either a substitute test or the portfolio. And the portfolio is, a collection of graded student work that students have to compile and with the support of their schools, sometimes even taking an entire course during their senior year to do all the paperwork and then submit to the state. We'll have more about the portfolio as we continue. Now, sometimes people think that the test is the only thing that determines whether or not the student graduates. But actually, the more important part of a student's career are the credits, the courses, and the experiences they have during high school that prepare them for, success later in life. And New Jersey sets minimum graduation course and credit requirements that every district must either have or have more demanding ones, higher ones. There are 120 credits in specific content areas that every student has to master. That means you have to take the course, you have to get a passing grade, and you have to amass the credits and go on to the next level. Districts may adopt higher credit requirements, and many do. I think, for example, in Elizabeth, I think the graduation credits have to be 140. I'm not sure what they are in a lot of others, but all of them must be at least 120. And a few years ago, these credits can be raised. For example, a few years ago, the state board did pass a requirement that students must take 3 lab sciences instead of having, less rigorous science classes like maybe family life or, something that didn't prepare them for a lab science course in college. Same thing with math. And sometimes those kinds of increases in requirements, can be legitimate, can give students access to better preparation, to more courses that will prepare them for college and careers. But simply changing the score on the test is not going to do that kind of work. Districts may also add attendance, service, and other requirements to the graduation requirements. The latest test that we have in New Jersey that's an exit test for graduation is the New Jersey Graduation Proficiency Assessment. This test was first administered to a class of juniors in last spring. This was the class of 2023, and the test was given them in March 2022. It was given before there was any field test, before in the past when they used to do testing in New Jersey. And I've been around for that whole alphabet soup of graduation tests. They used to give the test for 2, sometimes even 3 years before it was required as an exit test for graduation. But this time they introduced the NJGPA, and when the state board set a cut score for this test last February, they intended that to be a required graduation exit test, which is one of the most inappropriate uses of a standardized assessment. There is no standardized assessment that can tell you with a single score whether or not a student is ready or not to graduation. It's simply a misuse of testing. All tests, for example, have measurement error. If you give the same test to the same group over 2 or 3 different times, you will get a range of results. That range of results is the measurement error in a test. Even if it's attempting to assess something specific, it will give you a range. And so to have a cut score of 749, you're not ready for graduation, 750 you are, it's just absurd. It's an inappropriate use of tests, and it leads to educational abuse. And one of the worst forms of abuse we had was the arbitrary setting of a higher cut score for this test 1 month before they were giving it for the first time. They had no data. They had never given it to a class of students in a real situation. And yet, because some members on the State Board of Education were frankly confused about the different cut scores on different tests, like the New Jersey Student Learning Assessment, which has a passing score of 750, and because they didn't really understand the process by which a cut score for a test is supposed to be set, they simply thought that the 725 was lowering standards and led by Vice President Mulvihill and influenced by Senator Teresa Ruiz, who in a really unusual move zoomed into that February meeting of the state board back in February 22 and urged them to raise the cut score. And so they did adopt a higher cut score of 750 and then expected that cut score to determine whether or not over 100,000 juniors in the class of 2023 were going to earn their diplomas when they took it in March. Fortunately, after the test, the NJGPA was administered for the first time, the legislature stepped in and it overwhelmingly passed a bill, A 3196, which waived the exit test requirement for the class of 2023. Basically, the legislators said, look, we are just returning to school. These kids missed almost 2 years of school. We are dealing with, a historical pandemic. We are dealing with a widespread and widely acknowledged mental health crisis of youth. And we have a test which is unproven and which is not an appropriate use to determine in this situation whether or not students should graduate. And so they stepped in and suspended the requirement that the students in the class of 2023 had to pass the test to get a diploma. And they ordered the NJDOE to use the administration of the test as a field test. Well, about a month ago, about 6 or 8 months after the state board originally promised to reveal the results of the field test, they finally got around to doing it. And I'd like to direct your attention especially to the blue section on these two graphs, which show what the passing rates would have been if they accepted the recommendation of the department and the test vendors to set the cut score or the passing score at 725. And one of the reasons that was given for setting this cut score at 725 was that unlike the NJSLA, which have 5 different performance levels, the NJGPA only had 2. You either graduate or you don't graduate. So it was a less precise test. Also, students were taking these tests on subject matter that they hadn't had for a year or two. Usually, most of these tests originally were designed to be given at the end of the course. But because the statute required the graduation test to be given in the 11th grade, students were being given a test on Algebra 1 that they might have taken as freshmen or sophomores, on English 1 and English 2 material that was a year removed, which was another reason why the cut score was determined to be 725. Now, again, all cut scores are arbitrary, all cut scores are political, but there is a standard setting process that the state board completely ignored when it adopted a 750 cut score simply because it felt that it should have a higher standard. It was a subjective attitude that was not based on any data or information, and it had a tremendous effect on the outcome of the test. For example, look at the English language graphs on the bottom. If the board had set the cut score at what the department and the test vendors had recommended, 80% of the students would have passed. Instead, they arbitrarily set the cut score at 750 and only 40% of the students passed. And because of this, the Department of Education sent notices to over 50,000 students that they were not ready for graduation. Even though that graduation requirement had been suspended for that class, and even though there was absolutely no data to send and tell families and students that a 750 score meant you were ready for graduation, and anything lower meant you weren't. It was just an absolute misuse of tests. And also was an irresponsible move by the State Board of Education to allow the department to do that. The other concern has been the increase that has been necessitated in the use of portfolio appeals, which require a lot more work, a lot more support from staff and districts, and a lot more time than taking a standardized test. The first thing you should look at is the difference between the number of students using portfolio appeals in 2019 and 2022. It's almost double. And that was before NJGPA. That was doubled because for 2 years, students didn't have state tests. So they had no opportunity to really meet the requirements. And they had to rely on the more onerous and the more demanding portfolio assessment. But the things that really got the board's attention were those totals in the middle, because that's what the department projected. They said to the Board of Education board, if you insist on keeping the score at 750, that we project next year, you are going to have 40,000 portfolios in ELA, 22,000 portfolios in math, and you are going to overwhelm districts, particularly our high needs urban districts, with an enormous number of portfolios that is almost unsustainable. And you will be creating a meltdown and a crisis. And the only reason we're not having this meltdown and crisis this year is because the legislature stepped in and suspended the requirement.
Stan, I just want to
Sure, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Absolutely.
just want to be clear for the portfolio. Who determines once the portfolio is complete that that student now is eligible to graduate? Is that at the district or at the state level?
The district approves, but
Okay.
then a sample or a segment of them go to the state for checking.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Process also that happens totally behind closed doors, and it's an escape valve. It's really very onerous for students. It's onerous for districts. It provides no useful information. It's an assessment that is designed to hide the fact that exit testing is a bad way to determine who graduates, and that some students are not going to do well on the standardized test. And then instead of giving more help or being given a chance to take more of the courses like art or music that may tie them to school and make them want to come in the morning, they are given a routine task of creating this portfolio to meet an outdated state requirement for this assessment to graduate.
Absolutely.
I also want to point out that here you see the numbers for the number of kids who graduate and the number of students who don't graduate in the typical class. New Jersey does a pretty good job of getting most of the students through, but you can see that each year there are about 10,000 kids who do not make it from freshman year to senior year and to graduate. And some of those kids don't make it because of these assessments, because there's too much testing, not enough teaching, there's not enough engagement in high school, there's not enough support for the students and their social and emotional needs, and there's too much reliance on standardized testing. Some of these students will be in districts where they won't get support to do the portfolio, where they'll be asked to come to a class before or after school or on Saturday, where maybe they can't. And there were over 100 high schools in New Jersey that did not submit a single portfolio last year. And so there are some districts where portfolio support is simply not available to students who need it. What should students and families who are having to deal with this, who have juniors or sophomores, what should they do? First thing they should do is become familiar with the updated rules. And you can look at that link, which will be in the materials going out after this event. You should especially check the updated cut scores for the substitute assessment. One of the things a student can do is find out if their score on the English 1 test or the English 2 test, or maybe an SAT or a PSAT test, maybe they've satisfied the requirement before they ever get to junior year. They would still have to sit for the NJDPA, but they could relax. They would know that they had met the requirement. So check out those scores for the substitute assessment. The other thing is, if you're struggling with the substitute assessments, see the guidance counselor. Check out your portfolio timelines and start that process as early as possible. And best of all would be to support legislators to support a new piece of legislation, A4639, which would finally put an end for exit testing and which passed the Assembly Ed Committee unanimously, but right now is stalled in the Senate. We'd like to see that move. I'm going to skip through these last two slides, so I don't want to take up too much time, but even with the 725 score that was adopted, there are going to be tens of thousands of kids who are going to have to take additional tests to graduate. And most of those kids are going to be the kids who struggle with standardized tests. So they're the ones who are bearing the burden of these policies. New Jersey already has more testing than it needs, and it can easily eliminate exit testing for high school diplomas and still have plenty of testing that tells us how schools and students are doing. I'm also going to talk a little bit about how the graduation rate is starting to fall, because the Department of Education from Washington, D.C. has come in and said that if you have an exit test in your state, you can no longer include in your graduation rate the special education students who receive an exemption from that test. Each year in New Jersey, there are about 5,000 students who, because of their individual education plans, their IEPs, they get their graduation diploma by completing alternative graduation assessments. And now the department has come in, this started under Betsy DeVos, but it's continued under the Biden administration. And it says you have to take those kids out of your official graduation rate. And in New Jersey, that means the graduation rate has started to drop. It dropped in 2021, and therefore there was no test in 2021 because it was suspended. And so it's starting to drop more as that test comes back. And 2022 was the first year that this rule was imposed when there was the graduation test requirement. And the graduation rate in New Jersey has fallen from about the low 90s to the mid 80s. There's a lot of bragging in New Jersey about how we've always had the #1 graduation rate. Well, if it stays in the mid 80s, it's going to drop to the mid 20s in terms of the national ranking. And this is all because we have an exit test. If we didn't have an exit test, those graduation diplomas from special ed kids would continue to count in the official graduation rate. So,
yeah, and Stan, before you go forward, I just want to highlight what I learned recently is that New Jersey is one of only 8 states that require exit testing still, which was startling to me because it's such a norm in New Jersey that, you would just think that that's just what we do in this nation, that in order to graduate, you have to take a test. But to find out that we're only one of 8 states still requiring them, that is pretty shocking.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Kaleena. I'm glad you emphasized that. It came down from a high of 27 states to 8 states. There have been about a dozen states which just in the last 4 or 5 years have rolled back their requirements for exit testing because they found it's not helping kids, it's not helping schools, it's not helping educators, and New Jersey should do the same. It's long overdue. So the New Jersey State Board of Education over the last 10 years has failed to satisfy the mandate that students and families receive a reliable graduation set of requirements when they enter 9th grade. It has adopted graduation rules so confusing and flawed, they were struck down by the court, and you have to be pretty bad to make your rules struck down by the court. They have overseen the largest increase in the misuse and overuse of standardized testing in New Jersey history. They've set arbitrary passing scores on state tests to set students and schools up for failure. They authorized the NJDOE to send inaccurate notices of tens of thousands of students saying they weren't ready for graduation. They implemented a high-stakes assessment without any field testing until the legislature stepped in. They wasted at least $200,000 on changing the NJPA cut score at the last minute last year, even though the cut score was never used for anything. They failed to release and review the results of the field test in September, as they said they would, instead just did it a month ago. And they failed to, let me roll this up. I can't even read my last line. I want to leave with a couple of suggestions for Governor Murphy, too, to replace all the State Board of Education members who are serving in expired seats, to press the legislature to move the 3 nominations that he's already made, to make additional nominations that draw on the New Jersey's vibrant education advocacy community and to reflect the diversity of the state's public school population, to pass the bill that would make good on his campaign promise to end exit testing for graduation, and with an eye to the changes we need at the federal level to support Representative Jamal Bowman's new federal law, which would eliminate some of the worst testing mandates that people use in New Jersey to defend the over-testing and the misuse of standardized testing. I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Stan. I'm just going to check because I saw something here. So there are a couple of questions, but first just want to say thank you for that presentation and especially that rundown of the failures of the State Board of Education. This isn't personal, not about the people, but clearly New Jersey and ELC has had a lot to do with New Jersey becoming one of the most, if the not most progressive state in regards to education in this country, but yet we are falling behind. And at the core of that fall behind is the inadequacy of our State Board of Education. We need people on that board who are progressive, who are thinking about public schools, who are thinking about public school children, who are advocating for policies and practices that get more students graduating, that get more families able to plan for the future of their young people without receiving letters that their kids are failing, or are in danger of not graduating. I would lose my mind if I got a letter like that about my son, right when it's time for him to go off into the world. So, just thank you for that. And we second, our Children, Our Schools seconds all of what Stan has outlined as appropriate next steps. I'm going to take one question and then we're going to move to our next presentation, and then we'll have some questions at the end. So one question, Stan, comes from Darren Martin, a good friend of ours, Darren Martin. So just asking if we can share the information about the 3 individuals who have been nominated. Yes, that have been nominated to the State Board of Education. We will definitely share that information. Mr. Martin, one of them is Mary Bennett, who's a local leader in Newark, and an educator for many decades, but we'll share details about them in our follow-up, absolutely. And the second question was, has any parent organizations met with the New Jersey Senate president to move the confirmations along? Our Children, Our Schools has requested meetings with the New Jersey Senate president and various other decision makers in the legislature. We encourage those who are here to do that as well. We have to raise this issue. There is just simply not enough people paying attention to the State Board of Ed and its role in education policy. And these 13 expired seats, not enough people. We haven't had a confirmation since 2017 on the State Board of Education. We have dropped the ball, leaders, education advocates, on this. It's time to pick it back up. And so that is my answer, Mr. Martin. Yes, we need to have those conversations with our legislators and say, confirm these nominees, and as Stan put it, make more nominations so that we can have 13 effective seats. All right, now to tell us about the Managing for Equity Code, another very important issue before the State Board of Education, is Dr. Leah Owens. There was a hearing last week, a lot of excellent presentation, testimony about this. Dr. Owens, what's going on with the Equity Code?
Oh, thank you, Kaleena. Yeah, absolutely. The public testimony session was definitely one to have seen. Hopefully, well, it's not something that's going to be made readily available. You would have to Oprah the recordings, but it was interesting to say the least. So I'm going to jump right in to my presentation. So what I put in the chat are actually 2 things. So one, extended slides, because the slides I'm showing actually draws from, we'll be showing draws from a larger research project that I'm conducting with Marcellus and Medeiros. We are co-researchers on this. And then next, the second link I put in the chat is a letter, some background on the Equity Code, and then a letter template, because there is still time to submit your own public testimony in writing, should you be so compelled to do that after this awesome presentation. All right. Yeah, so just some quick background. So in 2003, the State Board of Education adopted New Jersey Administrative Code 6A7, Managing for Equality and Equity in Education. And so this is actually a code that has come after what was formerly known as NJAC 6.4, Equality in Educational Programs. Always want to get those words exactly right. And so Equality in Educational Programs was adopted in 1975. And so that really came out of civil rights struggle, the couple of decades that Brown had been rendered as a decision, and schools around the country started to integrate. And then there's a bunch of impacts that happen as a result of that. And then the push to have equal educational opportunity. So that was really the language at that point in time. And so when the state board went to readopt and reset all of their codes, and that's why we have 6A nowadays rather than just 6, the title, the essence remained the same, the title changed, and then there were some additional responsibilities that were added to this new code. And so as you can see, I have there, the short of it is to ensure all students are provided equal access to educational programs and services by district boards of education. And what Stan alluded to, and I believe Kaleena mentioned as well, right? We are in the midst of a New Jersey Supreme Court case on the fact that our schools are segregated racially and economically, and we are looking to have a decision. Latino Action Network Foundation, NAACP New Jersey State Conference, of which I'm a member, and then other litigants who are children around the state being represented by their parents. So we are looking for a decision to be rendered. We know that our schools are highly segregated. It's more about getting that decision so that we can move forward with some actual practices in place, some the words escaping me, but much like Abbott, some remedies, so that we can have some remedies actually put in place. And this equity code should be key to that. So the image on the left side of the screen just is a screenshot of the first page of the code, and you'll see some of the responsibilities that fall underneath this code. At the very bottom, so again, if you click on the link in the chat, you can see the full slides that I am drawing from. And so this just points to some other research that you may be interested in taking a look at. So I do want to give an overview of the rulemaking process. It actually has a code all by itself, all the stages and steps that have to take place. So normally a code that comes in front of the State Board of Education goes through these 5 levels. So they do have discretion. However, a lot of times there is not an actual policy discussion. There might be some conversation in the policy committee of the State Board of Education. But a lot of the times nowadays, they actually don't, they just skip over this level altogether. They don't consider the research that's out there, the studies, what different interested constituents have to say before they actually draft code or suggest adoptions if the code actually exists. This is something the State Board of Education probably should reconsider, especially with what I'll be presenting about the equity code. Then it moves to first discussion and second discussion, which essentially means it's put on the agenda for each state board meeting. And they take feedback both from the state board members, but also the public. As you see, they're embedded in second discussion, and then what's called proposal level are official public testimony sessions. The board had just recently, I believe it was February, or it might have been March, return to in-person meetings. So prior to that, you could only submit written testimony over those last couple of years during the pandemic. But again, as Kaleena said, last week was an in-person public testimony session. And then after the proposal level, which a code and all of its proposed amendments are published in what's called the New Jersey Register, which is the official publication of all of the codes to keep track of what is changing, what's coming new, what's going out. So after that's published, there's 60 days for the public to give feedback. And then from there, the State Board of Education will usually put the code back onto its agenda, and then they will adopt it. So all along during these different stages, the feedback that the Department of Education receives and curates, they will infuse into amendments if they feel they should. So again, pointing out that this is these slides are drawing from a larger research that Marcella and I are doing. And so we really point out 3 concerns. What I'm going to focus in, I'm going to dive deep in this presentation, is this concern about an uncritical use of the term opportunity gap. But overall, it's important to know that these amendments that are being proposed, disregard race and downplay biases despite the role of race in perpetuating inequities. And what I want to say about that, kind of going back to some of the background on the code, is that the Managing for Equality and Equity in Education Code really draws from New Jersey's law against discrimination, which was passed in 1945. So this is a long-standing law. It also comes out of civil rights struggles. It has been amended many times over the decades to make sure that all protected classes and categories of people are included, and what other things that change in terms of the law. And so that is really the basis for the Managing for Equity, just to keep it short, code is the law against discrimination. We would not be talking about equity, and it wouldn't be such an important item if we didn't actually have discrimination in this country. And I think most, if not all of us on this call, understand the history of this country, of institutionalized racism and other oppressions that really continue to seep into society today. So here is a slide presented by the Department of Education to the state board, right? So the Department of Education is the administrative arm, the executive branch, if you will, and then the State Board of Education is the legislative branch, right? They deal with policy, they amend it, they pass it. But really it's the Department of Education administrators who do the bulk of this work of the drafting, again, of curating all of the comments that come in from the public, and then they make it more concise for the State Board of Education members and present it to them. Now, that does not mean that the State Board of Education members should not be reading everything that is submitted, but that is usually the relationship between the Department of Ed and the State Board of Education. So the Department of Education presented this as an amended definition of the term equity in the code. And so the way that you read this, if you're not familiar, is that words that are in brackets are proposed to be deleted, and words that are in bold are being proposed to be added. So I would actually give the Department of Education kudos for this amended definition of equity. It is definitely stronger than the previous one, particularly pointing out that their students are in an educational environment that is fair, just, and impartial to all individuals. This speaks to anti-discrimination. This speaks to inclusivity. And so that's really important. And then also that equity focuses on consistent and systematic access. And that is really important as well for that keyword system. So the Department of Education, I feel, in amending this definition this way, is recognizing their responsibility to make sure that the system is working well for all students. And again, most, if not all of you may be familiar with that term that we say over and over again in the educational advocacy field and world, and that is quoting the New Jersey Constitution, that it is responsible for providing, the state is responsible for providing a thorough and efficient system of education. So it's good that they're acknowledging their role. However, right, little turn. Even with that beginning point, there are a number of issues in addition to what was presented on that previous slide that Marcella and I point out in our research. And the main summing up of those issues, I would say, is that the Department of Education's proposed amendments are misaligned with this new definition of equity. And so while they make a very good attempt at revising the entire code, they start off well, but then a lot of the rest of the amendments they propose just don't align with what they say they are trying to do. And a key example of that is the inclusion of opportunity gap, which is great, but they do not include that definition in a critical way. They essentially use the same definition of achievement gap and swap out the word achievement for opportunity, and that's not how opportunity gap works. They do understand that opportunity gap is about the inputs and achievement gap is about the outputs. However, if we're really going to revise the definition of equity and make this code stronger, continuing to put emphasis on achievement gap does not make sense. There is a misalignment there. And I will also want to point out what's highlighted in the definition of achievement gap. the difference in academic performance among student groups as a result of membership in one or more of the protected categories. And then what you see listed in brackets are examples of protected categories: race, gender, class usually are the ones that we think of the most often. But as a result of, so you're telling me that the academic performance is occurring because I am a member in one of these categories, because I am Black. That's why academic performance, there's a gap occurring. Because I'm a woman, that's why there's a gap occurring. So this is a uncritical use of language. Instead, they really need to name the actor, right? So achievement gap is a result of discrimination. Achievement gap is a result of oppression. Achievement gap is a result of institutionalized racism. So this is an example of what I'm saying about this misalignment. So they start off well in changing some language, but they don't carry through throughout the entire document.
Dr. Owens, that is a huge, huge issue that should really upset and concern all of us. All of us. That is dangerous language, actually. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And like Stan, I'm an English teacher, right? But it's not just about holding the red pen in my hand, but it's really about what is our intentionality around revising this code. And we can't just be plopping in terms because they are, you know, the fad, they're the buzzwords. And in fact, that's actually what happened back in 2003 when the Managing for Equity Code was first adopted. Achievement gap, there was a conversation among board members about making sure they're being intentional with that term and not just including it as a buzzword. And the way that the department is using opportunity gap right now, it is very much aligned to that same conversation 20 years ago. I question if they have a clear understanding of what opportunity gap is about. And so that speaks to this first point in terms of problems with an achievement gap framework. So these undergirding issues go unchallenged. And Jacqueline Jordan Irvine in her research lists out many of the opportunity gaps. They include the teacher quality gap, the teacher preparation gap, the challenging curriculum gap, the school funding gap, the digital divide gap, the wealth and income gap, the employment opportunity gap, the affordable housing gap, the healthcare gap, the nutrition gap, the school integration gap, and the quality childcare gap. So all of these other gaps that are both education and non-education related have an impact on the achievement that our students are able to have in their education. And if we don't talk about all of these undergirding issues, then we're going to continue to have this quote unquote achievement gap and see the same results. And I think that overlaps with many of the points that Stan was making in his presentation. And so for those who are, particularly those who are familiar with critical race theory, right, when we talk about taking a critical approach to how we're amending this code, if we know that tenet of whiteness as property. So the achievement gap and that language, that discourse that really popped up as a result of No Child Left Behind 20 plus years ago being enacted, came from a place of, well, if we disaggregate the data, we'll be able to compare different student groups and see, you know, who's doing well and who's not, and essentially penalize those districts who are not educating all their children. So in theory, that sounds great. You want to see, you know, who's doing well, who's not. However, and folks, I'm sure at that time knew, I was just becoming a teacher at that time, knew that the comparison piece was not going to create change. The comparison piece was just going to perpetuate white supremacy, a white norm, a white standard, and continue to show us how Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are not like their white counterparts, right? And continue to give us this framework and this argument that, well, those children over there aren't able to do well because they're not meeting the standard that we have set. However, a critical approach would say we need to actually interrogate whiteness and think about how white folks have been able to be quote unquote successful. White students have been able to be overwhelmingly quote unquote successful in their academics. And again, it points back to some of those points from the opportunity gap and the history of this country. We cannot just talk about education without identifying that. We don't need to dwell there, but it should be the jumping point for how we actually enact change so that we have equitable educational opportunity. I talked about that third point as a result of, so the language that follows that phrase right now shows a deficit perspective. So we're looking at these different children that are part of these different groups, right, of protected categories and classes as having a problem. It is them. So if you weren't a member of that class, then you would be doing better, right? And so this contradicts what, again, the Department of Education is saying they're doing when they say they're reframing the code from an asset-based approach. Again, you do not see that throughout the entire document. And last, in terms of a problem with an achievement gap framework, is that it focuses on the individual rather than the structure. Again, it is the role of both the Department of Education and the State Board of Education to look at the structures that are being put in place so that we can have localized solutions and practices, and those solutions and practices are in turn fostered by the structure. Right. And so I want to wrap up with the timeline that was presented by the Department of Education during first discussion, which was last December. And then for the most part, they followed this. However, the proposal was not published in New Jersey Register until the very beginning of April. So they're a little bit off on time, but for the most part, if they continue to push down the trail, even though so many people came out last week with differing perspectives, right? Not just the perspective that I'm presenting to you today, differing perspectives about the code and the problems they have with the code for different reasons. The board may decide to continue to move. However, the Latino Action Network Foundation and the New Jersey State Conference of the NAACP have both requested what is called a public hearing, which would provide time just to focus on this code. And so we are looking to hear back from them, the State Board of Education, by the end of next week to see if they're going to grant that special public hearing. And then last, again, this is information that came from the original slides. There is still time to submit public testimony. So if there's anything that you want to say, any input that you have in terms of what the equity code should include, again, there are many, 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 many more issues, including the comprehensive equity plan, which is really nothing more than a checklist. It is not a real document or a lever for change for school districts. So I'll just quickly say that. But if you have any other issue that you want to raise, you still have time to submit that information. And then last, if you want to get in touch with either myself or Marcella, here's our contact. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Owens, for that presentation as well. It's both of these issues are issues that we might not, largely many of us would not be aware of if you and Stan and folks like you were not paying attention at the state level to what's happening in education policy. So thank you so much. I'm hoping that both of your presentations will encourage, one, all of us to pay more attention at the state level to what's happening. That's what trickles down at the district level. Right now, the State Board of Education has two very important decisions before it. Hopefully it will decide to have that hearing. We do need to start talking about getting rid of exit testing. That comes with advocacy. And so, education advocacy is important. You two have been doing this for a very long time. I hope you don't plan to stop, because we can't stop. Because once you take your eye off the ball, things begin to slip through the cracks. And while it may seem like language in a code is not that important, it's everything. It's everything. I want to get to a couple of the questions that were there before we wrap up. I will kind of sum up. Monique Andrews kind of asked, and I'm going to make it, Ms. Andrews, if it's okay, more relevant to this particular conversation. Advocacy is intimidating. And at the local level, parent advocates, I'm one of them who's had to go before my local Board of Education. And I'm sure as you all continue to bring issues to legislative bodies, that is intimidating. So, how do you handle that, taking on leadership at the state level and the policies that don't work for our children? What is some advice that you would give to parent advocates who may want to also start to advocate for these particular issues at the state level even as well? So, how do we get past that angst that comes with advocacy?
I would definitely say don't do it alone. Find some other, hopefully, other parents, but other folks who are interested in that same issue have some of the same concerns. They only have to exactly overlap. Even if you have differing concerns, that could really make for good conversation and make your arguments even stronger. But definitely is not something to do alone. If you're not a member of an organization, you should think about doing that, or start your own organization, but just don't do it alone. That would be probably my key advice.
Thank you. Stan, you have anything you want to add?
I would definitely agree with that. That was my first suggestion. I would also tell stories about what the effect of the policy is on people you know, on people you love, on yourself. Story what's happening so that people can relate to it.
Yeah, and some of the local issues that you're facing can be taken to the state board as well. You know, sometimes you need a different lens that on your issue. So don't be afraid. If at the local level you're not able to get past certain barriers, take it to the State Board of Education. They have public testimony. Rosella Clyde, our task force member and a representative from the League of Women Voters, said, "Thank you, Leah, for the clarification of these issues. I never thought about the difference between achievement and opportunity gap. I now have a great new lens with which to examine the equity discussion." That's powerful, Rosella. Who is presenting this discussion to the State Department of Education? Do you know that, Dr. Owens?
You say presenting
This conversation, this discussion around that language to the State Department of Education. I'm guessing Rosella is saying they need to hear this too.
Oh, yeah. So this is a part of my testimony, my own public testimony that I'm submitting to the State Board of Education. And last week, the newly formed statewide educational equity coalition was there in force. So again, New Jersey State Conference of NAACP, Latino Action Network Foundation, La Casa de Pedro, Urban League, People's Organization for Progress, which are some of the organizations that are part of this coalition that provided testimony last week in person. And then there's also written testimony that's coming as well. So there is a formal group, if you will, who's raising these issues. But again, I mean, you can submit, you don't have to wait to be a member of an organization. You could submit your own public testimony, tonight.
Yes, thank you. Jay Arena, I'm not going to go too deep in this because I'm so sorry. I should have been prepared. But Jay Arena wanted us to go over again about the nomination. So Governor Murphy is who appoints the State Board of Education. It is Governor Murphy's job to appoint the State Board of Education members. He hasn't made any appointments yet in his tenure as governor. The last appointments were made by our last governor, okay? So that tells you a great deal. So our Democratic governor, Phil Murphy, we began to kind of say last year, hey, you need to do this, you need to do this. And so 3 appointments were made, very progressive, strong leaders in education. One of them happened to be Mary Bennett. A lot of us here are from this, area. We know Mary Bennett as a very strong nominee. Governor Murphy made those nominations. Then the Senate Judiciary Committee is supposed to confirm those nominations. They put it on the agenda and they confirm that nomination, and then it continues to move forward. Unfortunately, it has stopped at the nomination. They are not responding to our questions of why. And so our Children, Our Schools is raising this issue high. That's why we're having this forum. We want people to understand that this is happening and that we need everybody calling on the governor to say, hey, you've made these nominations. It's your job to appoint people. Do not let the Senate Judiciary Committee or senatorial courtesy or any of these political things hold us up, because look at the topics and the issues that are before the state board. We have issues about equity and language. And if we don't have the right people, we get into situations where the cut score is 25 points off, and now 40% more students are at risk of failing to meet a graduation requirement, or where you have one word replaced, opportunity gap, but you don't replace any of the other technical language, and so it really doesn't have any effect. We want people on the state board who are paying attention to the details and really thinking about what's best for children. So the obstacle is us. I'm going to say the obstacle is us. We have to show that we care about the state board and that we're paying attention. So how you can do that? 1, signing our petition, our Children, Our Schools petition, joining us in raising our voices and saying that we want movement on this. Also, emailing the governor, calling the governor's office, emailing the Senate Judiciary Committee members, your local representatives, and telling them we need you all to pay attention to this, all right? So hopefully, Jay, that has answered your question. And I'm going to give the very last question to Stan. Greg Stankiewicz from the Community Schools Coalition, the New Jersey Community Schools Coalition. I know I'm getting the name wrong. I'm so sorry. Put it in the chat for me, someone, so that I can redeem myself. I am a bit, my mind is everywhere. But Greg says, what other types of actions would you recommend advocates take to support A4639/S3308 and end high school exit testing? So last question is to Stan. What else can we do?
Well, I think that's going to be a heavy lift, but I think the focus here is on the Senate Education Committee. I'm forgetting, I guess, the Senate President, is that Scutari these days?
Yes.
Is that right? He's got to post the bill. He's got to move it. Somebody in the Senate Education Committee. We know that for many years, Senator Ruiz has used her outsized influence on education issues to kind of block changes. One thing we should definitely push for this bill, but the other thing people should have on their radar is these rules that I described today only last for 24 and 25, and the State Department of Education is putting out a request for proposals for the next test, for yet another test after NJGPA, which we need to start stopping yesterday. So I would continue to track these issues, talk to your legislators, and, stay on the case.
Absolutely, stay on the case. And I think just to connect with Greg, the New Jersey Community Schools Coalition, that's the name of the organization. They're a great example of staying on the case, okay? Because New Jersey Community Schools Coalition has been advocating for community schools in New Jersey, and we are beginning to see traction. We're beginning to see state funding. People listen, but you have to stay the course. You have to fight. You have to raise your voices. And so that's what we're going to have to do. These are two issues. Why not dedicate 2023 to these two issues? The issue of the equity code and making sure that it's very clear about what that means in New Jersey, and also to making sure that we stop exit testing, because it just doesn't make any sense, okay? It doesn't make any sense. We are behind the ball. But the first step for all of that is to make sure that we have a state board of education that works for our children, all right? That works for our children and our schools. Thank you, Dr. Owens, so much for your excellent presentation. Thank you, Stan Karp, for your excellent presentation, for educating us, empowering us, so that we can engage in these kinds of conversations and also in this very important advocacy work. Thank you to all of our Children in Our Schools Task Force members who have been leading this charge to get this right. I know we're gonna win this fight. Everyone on the call, sign the petition, share the petition, and the next time we have a forum, invite your friends, okay? Because education, knowledge is power, all right? Thank you all so much. Have a great, great evening. Thank you again to Sharon Kringle, Nicole Chulo, Yolanda Green, for all that you do. And we will see you all at the next forum, which will also be about the State Board of Education, because we're not letting up until we write that board, all right? Have a good night, everyone. Thank you. We will send out all of the materials in a follow-up email this week. All right.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you so much.